Hi everyone, thank you for joining us for another episode of Keeping It Behavioral, where we're empowering parents one episode at a time and breaking down behavior analytic topics to what they look like in the real world. My name is Ray Trank, and I'm joined by my co-host,
Adrian Beggs. We're going to be diving into the world of autism services, decoding the nuances of ABA in different settings. So we're going to be looking at ABA in schools and ABA in more ABA settings, such as in-home or in-clinic. And that sounded funny. But so in-home or in-clinic, and really just kind of discussing the pros and the cons to each area. Mm-hmm. And so that way, hopefully, there's no right or wrong answer, but you can make a more informed decision about what works best for your learner.
And finding your fit, right?
Absolutely. So I think the first thing that you really need to look at before you even dive into what setting you want to do ABA is, and it's looking at what are the goals that you have for your learner.
Right. And I feel like that's informed by a variety of things, right?
Yes.
How old are they?
I think that's a big one.
Yeah.
Because age plays such a role, especially in, the United States where, school is very age.
Yeah, everything
specific.
is age driven. Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's a really big one.
Yeah.
Another thing to think about too is, do you even want them to go to school?
This is major, especially when you're considering what does the timeline look like for your individual family.
Yes.
There are a lot of people that consider homeschooling,
yes.
Or private or
private school.
You're right, exactly. And so I feel like that, especially if you decide, which we'll get into this, but the early intervention piece, but especially if you're looking at that does change the steps you take now.
Yes.
When you're trying to look ahead to what your timeline looks like for that.
Yes. I think another thing to look at too is what are the primary concerns that you're having with your learner.
Right.
Because the different settings, we'll go into the pros and cons of each setting once we kind of break it down in a minute, but kind of really looking at, is my concern them being able, we call it generalization, but are they able to demonstrate skills in different settings, or is it learning or acquiring new skills, really
which we call skill acquisition.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Really honing in on what the biggest priority is for your family.
Or maybe it's behavior reduction. Maybe
yes,
you're going into this
one.
And you're like, listen, my kid has all these fantastic foundational skills. They'd be great in a learning setting like a school, but we're dealing with all these, quote unquote disruptive behaviors. Maybe that's, aggression or tantruming or whatever that might look like for your child. And maybe the focus of care would be, how can we teach different types of replacement behaviors and skills so they don't have to engage in those behaviors to have their wants and needs met.
Absolutely. And I think too, looking at where are you seeing those behaviors occurring?
Mm-hmm.
Is it primarily when you're going out in the community, or is it more so when you're giving them kind of an expectation that's getting put across them, because that can impact it too.
100%.
Another thing that's important to consider is what are the barriers that your family has? Mm-hmm. What obstacles do you have to accessing care? Do you have really rigid work schedules? Are you not home a lot? Kind of looking at all that, because that plays a big role. And I think we can kind of go into the specifics in each setting.
Yeah, and I think so too, the consistency piece, right?
Yes.
There is, and this is something Adrian said at the beginning, there is no right or wrong choice. It's just figuring out what fits the best with your lifestyle and what type of setting would allow for the most consistency for you and your child, because that's going to be really important as you're, either increasing behaviors, decreasing behaviors, learning new skills. The consistency piece is really, really important.
100%.
So going into each setting, I'm Adrian's going to probably kick us off because she has a lot of experience on school-based settings, so she can kind of give us some pros and cons with that.
Yeah, so I used to work in a school-based setting, and so I think the biggest pro, well, and I guess holistically, right? So in schools, you're going to have a higher ratio of learners to staff. And the specific ratio that you have depends a lot on what your child is looking at or working on. But it'll always pretty much be higher than what it would be in ABA.
Right. Which isn't necessarily bad.
Which is not necessarily bad, because I think that's the biggest thing, is they have a lot more focus on academics. Insurance is very specific when it comes to ABA.
We've all been there with that one.
That you cannot be working on like explicitly academic things.
Right.
Because that is not deemed as, an essential skill to insurance. And I think
that's a whole,
debate, and I think any person providing ABA would love to talk about that.
Right.
But, and the other thing is what we call generalizing skills, or being able to take skills that they're learning and demonstrate them in other settings with other individuals. Because in a school, you go to different classes. So even if you're in elementary where you have one like homeroom teacher, or if you're in a self-contained special education class where there is one teacher that you're in there primarily with, you'll have other like Texas we call paraprofessionals, but some people call it aides. I mean,
whatever you call it, it's the same function.
The support staff in the room, or, the art teacher, the music teacher. You're going to all these different people who you're going to have to demonstrate the skills with. And so you're going to get that a lot with school. So, breaking it down to pros and cons, I think the biggest pro is that, at least for public school, and I know private school is also an option, but that's kind of its own thing, is public school is free.
Right.
And so, which I know taxes, but
free in a sense.
Free in a sense.
Yeah.
No additional cost.
No additional cost, yeah.
But which I think is probably one of the biggest barriers that people face, is that ABA is extremely expensive.
And with insurance too, it's a whole finicky situation of approval and hours and all.
But so I think that's like the biggest pro is there's no cost. And I think another one is that there are related providers that are within the school that also come at no additional cost.
Right.
So if your child has a speech delay, if they have gross motor or fine motor challenges, they're able, as long as they qualify, they're able to get those services within the school day, no additional charge.
And they have those resources.
And they have those resources. And they also, I think another pro too that we don't talk about too much is in schools you have a lot more children who are on their developmental, their developmental level matches their chronological age or their real age. So you're getting a lot of peer models for kind of those behaviors that you want them to learn.
Well, and there are a lot of, and this is something we talked about forever ago, like the Walden model.
Yes.
Being a thing. There is a lot of research to honestly, support the idea that kids are constantly picking things up from peers.
Yes.
So having positive peer models can be really powerful in developing all sorts of skills and fostering growth in those types of skills.
Absolutely. And I think that kind of also goes into the cons that kind of you run into at the school-based setting is you're not going to get the truest form of ABA therapy in a school because it's not one-on-one, and because of the academics and all the other things that you have to build into your day, it's just going to look a little bit different. Which again, not necessarily a bad thing, but it is just kind of depending on your lens of what you're expecting and what outcomes you're wanting to get out of.
Right.
Also, so it's not as much like one-on-one direct therapy.
Well, and just like you said, because of the ratios, which can act as a pro, but can also be a con where it's, I mean, especially when we're thinking about how we're preparing learners for being in a school-based setting, going into it, I would say, with a lot more independent skills will make it easier for them to navigate that type of setting and be successful. So the ratios is definitely something to think about. does your kiddo need more of that hands-on one-on-one support to be successful?
Yes.
Or do they have the skills where they can look around at peers, pick up on what they're doing, and then follow their lead?
Yeah, and maybe just need a little bit of extra support,
Right.
or moderate, or even a higher level support, but they're still able to pick up on those things.
Right.
Another, barrier that is with the school setting is it is just less individualized to your family's individual needs, because it all goes back to accessing the curriculum.
And being at the mercy of the state and whatever curriculum they have to be.
Well, and IEP meetings or whatever your state calls them, when they're talking about the services that are being provided to special education learners, it all goes back to accessing the curriculum that is set forth by the state.
And then IEP.
So that is going to be the focus. Individualized education plan.
Right, for those who don't know what IEPs are.
If you don't have a child in school yet.
Right, yes. Which that's a pretty standard practice, right? Every kiddo that goes in who might need additional supports goes through an IEP meeting,
if they
right?
have, you have to qualify for special education services. But if your child, is evaluated, qualifies for special education, that is something that happens yearly to review the services that are being, recommended and just done by the school, and kind of what setting, right, is most appropriate for your kiddo too. Sorry if you can hear my dog licking in the background. That was weird.
Whoa. Okay. So that's kind of school-based learning. And so I guess hearing all the pros and cons with that might bring you to, okay, well, what if my child is not ready for a setting where they might need a little bit more independence? They might need to have some of those foundational skills of imitation, being able to imitate peers. And that is not something that's naturally inherent to all learners, right?
No.
Like that oftentimes with the population that we serve and the learners we work with, that oftentimes is a skill that we have to help nurture and develop in learners. So let's say you're at that point. Then maybe you're like, okay, what would be a good fit for my kid? We would probably look into ABA services.
Yes, and that direct therapy.
Right, the direct. Yeah, direct therapy. And just like what Adrian said, we talked about ratios. The beauty of a pure ABA setting, and which we'll get into whether or not it's clinic or in-home, because that does, change what that looks like. You do get that one-to-one support.
Yes.
You have someone who their only job is to pay attention to your child all day long.
Yes.
Work on breaking down skills into smaller, digestible steps.
Yes.
So that you're either reducing those behaviors that you don't want to see as much of, or you're really fostering and cultivating the development of behaviors that will allow your kiddo to be independent in the future and thrive eventually in a school setting. Because I think that's an important thing to mention is ABA is not a permanent, long-term, like, oh, my kid's going to be in this for the next 10 years.
Yes.
This is more of a field that focuses on skill building.
Yes.
So that you can then apply those skills to, more immersive settings where you can be out in the community and out in school and be successful.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of the evidence really supports it, especially with early learners. But obviously the benefits are regardless of what age you're able to start at, because I know, ABA, it's not
not unknown,
but it is kind of becoming more mainstream, more accessible,
Well, I think especially after it's been there's a refocus on what ABA looks like now, because people, I think, before were very much like, ooh, I don't want to touch that with the history of it.
Yes, which is a whole nother conversation.
We will cover that at some point, but
yes,
so then,
I think the foundational skills is like the biggest.
Huge. It's huge.
Oh, and I think too, it's more immersive, more comprehensive. You're able to work on a bunch of different, domains.
Highly individualized.
Yes, and it's highly individualized. And I think too, even beyond individualized, especially and I mean, this is a little bit geared towards younger learners, because as they get older, it's individualized to the client's wants and needs, right?
Right.
But if you have a child, who's 2, 3, 4, 5, who isn't at a point where they're able to really express what those are.
Which that qualify as our early intervention learners.
Yes.
So oftentimes we use that phrase a lot, like our early intervention or early learners. That is the age range that we're talking about.
Yes. And so with that age, the family is such a big part, and I mean throughout their lifespan, right?
Always, yeah.
And even as adults, right? A lot of people reference their families,
right? Caregivers,
what they're what's important to them. But really looking at like what are the obstacles we're having as a family and how we can get support, because maybe it's something that you think is outside the realm of something you can get services of, like going to the grocery store or you know, going to the park, going to the zoo, like...
Well, there are some families that have, and it can be specific too, where it's like, oh, I have never been able to go to the movies with my kid, and that's something that my family loves to do, and I would love for my kid to be able to do that. ABA is something you can use to achieve those things that maybe you feel are super individualized and maybe niche.
And I think that's right, in addition to the kind of more... just general foundational skills that most people, you know, need as they continue getting older and building skills like the imitation, the vocalization or communication, whatever that looks like for your child.
And for programming in general. I mean, like you said, a lot of times the very first thing that an analyst who's working with your child would probably, you know, start planning for is, how can I teach this learner to communicate their wants and needs?
Yes, that's the foundation.
Huge foundation. And again, that kind of goes into some of the imitation skills and some of those foundational pieces. So obviously we're a little biased in this sense where we really support the use of ABA. But as Adrienne said too, there is a lot of literature out there, which we can pull some resources and put them in the show notes, that do talk about the benefits of utilizing ABA, and regardless of the time period, but especially for early intervention, especially for those early learners who can really benefit from having that care up front. Now, all that being said, we talked about one of the pros of school being that it's free. ABA is not cheap. It is very, very expensive. And a lot of times, too, when you're in ABA, you're not just going to be doing ABA. A lot of times, you know, if something is, we start seeing some motor deficits or speech delays, we may, and oftentimes do, consult with other specialists, and we say, hey, maybe you want to check out some occupational therapy, maybe speech therapy. So it is important to think about the fact that it's not just the cost of ABA. Oftentimes it's ABA plus some. Yeah.
Well, and I think too, that's a barrier too, because depending on where you live and how accessible resources are, right? Like in schools, they have like a speech therapist on staff who like is already serving other people in the school. So it's very, you know, they're already there. So if we put in like a recommendation for referral, like, it's not
like cool. He or she will add them to their list of people they're gonna.
They have to evaluate them and do all that. But it's more accessible. Whereas, you know, and we'll go into the different settings, primary settings for ABA, but you know, depending on the company that you're with or whatever, there may be some like where you have to go find your own, you know, speech provider or OT provider.
Which can be really overwhelming too, to find your fit, because just like with ABA, it's not going to always be that they're serving your kiddo in the same way. Every provider has their own unique approach to care.
Absolutely.
I will say though, a lot of clinics do have a set either company or provider.
Usually they'll have somebody they can recommend you to.
Right. And there are those resources. And so oftentimes those providers end up serving a lot of kiddos within one facility too, because a lot of people are looking for that holistic care. So you can have some providers travel to your clinic. So just that is an option, but it is also something to think about just with cost.
And I think another like component of the insurance is with Medicaid. Depending on what state you live, your access to care if you're on Medicaid is vastly different.
100%.
Because I know Arizona is a big state that fortunately does have really good access to ABA services if your child is on Medicaid. But then like we're in Texas, and I know Texas is not. It's very difficult to find a provider
and overall
to accept it.
ABA is still fairly new in getting into that space and accepting, you know, that type of insurance or state funded. So
just a lot another thing to consider. And I think the more open, and I know we kind of talked about this in our last episode too, right? The more open you are with the provider, the more like upfront they can be on like, right? Because everyone who's in the profession does it because they care.
Hopefully.
They should.
They should.
I'm sure there are exceptions, just like with any other profession.
Right.
But for the most part, they care. And
right.
so if you have like the openness of like, you know, either you're going to be transitioning to Medicaid or whatever, just having that conversation, because maybe, you know, their company does have a limitation to where they're not able to provide services with that. And that goes beyond to Medicaid. Every insurance company is different, and every provider is credentialed with certain insurances, so they may not accept yours even if it is a private policy. But just having the conversation of like, this is the insurance I have, or like maybe I'm on this insurance now, but it's going to be switching, so they can refer you to other providers if they're, you know, does not accept it.
Well, and oftentimes too, a lot of companies have their own separate branch that deals directly with insurance and negotiating.
Yes.
Because even if you're going with like a standard insurance plan, let's say, or private pay, your BCBA and that company can be some of your biggest advocates for, you know, getting access to care, because a lot of times your analysts that you're working with end up being the ones that are directly dealing with insurance and pushing for certain hours to get approved. Because of course insurance, their goal is to approve as little as possible. So like you said, that transparency piece of like, what type of insurance are you using? Because there are some insurance providers that it can be a little bit trickier to get approved more hours with. So again, being upfront with your providers, they can ensure that they're pushing for whatever is best for your child, I think is really important.
Absolutely. And so looking at that direct care ABA, there really are two main branches: the clinic, right, services, and then in-home services.
Right.
So with clinic, it is still that one-on-one direct therapy care. And you have the peers, you know, there's more structure outside of just your client's day. And especially if your goal is to have your child go to school at some point, there are similarities to that, because right, it's a building that they go to that has routines and structures that are kind of like the general flow.
And I will say too, an important like little caveat with clinic. Most clinics, I don't know, obviously I can't speak for every single clinic, but the majority of clinics, when they are taking kiddos, they will serve the age range of around 2, sometimes to 10 to 12. If they're maybe, you know, they have the resources and ability to have older kids, but the majority of clinics will mainly be focusing on that like 2 to 7 range. And so clinic is a great option, especially for those early learners, because you have a lot of kiddos all together working on similar sets of skills, so they can work as great peers for one another. And I think, I mean, I feel like this is, most people probably already know this, but obviously with the clinic, you just have kiddos with autism in there. So when we say peer two, that's more just same age kiddos who are working on building the same sets of skills, not necessarily peers that are meeting those milestones in a more developmentally typical way. So I think that is just an important thing to note. And so typically,
but I do think too, in that same sense, right, autism is so encompassing of so many like strengths, skills that are being acquired. And so, you know, it's not like everyone who is in the clinic has the same set of skills or the same, you know, skills they're working on. So there is some pull and pull, but they all will have some sort of delay. In some area.
And this is something too that we also talked about. We recently did a fun presentation for an after school program. And we talked about autism being a mosaic. And how when you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism, right? Just like all of us are unique individuals. That's just, it's the same thing. I just like to give that little caveat just so that you know that it is, you're going to be, I think, a part of a really cool community of people that understand what it's like for, you know, your kiddo to have certain sensory needs. and just be working on building skills. It's a great immersive experience to do that.
Yes.
And the benefit of a clinic is you have your behavior analyst assigned to your case there all the time.
Yes.
They are there all the time. Your team is there all the time. They're constantly around the same sets of peers. You do get a lot of that, for lack of a better way to say it, like consistent monitoring.
Yeah.
So that way
and I think
it's
you have
accessible.
a lot more access to the generalization, right? Or working with different people. Because in a clinic, right, well, I know we're going to talk about in-home in a second, but in the clinic, they have, other technicians there. And so even if maybe they're not the technician working with your client, they're still getting to interact with them.
Which is
huge.
huge.
And when they're playing with their peers, the techs will be involved too, to where they're getting just more access to more people.
Right.
And then, like you said, they have the individual BCBA working with them, but like their clinical director is there all the time. Other BCBAs are there all the time. So if they ever are kind of like at a point where they're like, okay, I've tried X, Y, and Z, and like we're kind of stalling, there are so many other minds who are familiar with your child.
Yeah.
And they're seeing more than just, if you were to try to like consult with somebody who you haven't seen, right? You don't kind of have as much visibility and knowledge of like the holistic child.
Right, 100%. And I think that kind of leads us into in-home.
Yes.
I think in-home is also a really fantastic option for families. I feel like we see a lot of kiddos who are really working on some of those more home-based struggles.
Yes.
So let's say you're seeing a lot of behaviors within the home that you just need those supports with. Having targeted care within your home, your BCBA would come and see your child in home. A technician who's implementing the behavior plan will be in home. It really helps that learner work on the skills that they've already acquired in the most natural setting that that we're working toward. And so in-home can be really fantastic for that. It also has some of that flexibility that maybe you wouldn't necessarily have in a clinical setting.
Yeah, and I think too, it's a great tool as well for being able to see what it looks like day to day. Like if your child's in a clinic, yes, you can do like the family engagement where you go in, you get to see it. But with them being in home, you have so much more access to seeing that every single day and kind of really getting the full impact of like, maybe the bathroom was a big barrier. And then you're seeing the success, that they're having, and you can really be like, okay, if that's not what it's looking like when I'm trying to do it, what am I missing?
Right.
Or, you even catch them sometimes maybe doing something and you're like, well, that's not what it looks like when I try to have them do it.
Right.
And so you're able to kind of give that input as well of like, well, I do this when I take them to the bathroom and I don't see those behaviors, but for some reason you are. And so the BCBA is able to look and be like, oh, we need to implement that too, just to get that consistency, and you see it more in real time.
Right. And I think you're hitting on another thing with clinic. You have the most controlled, quote unquote, perfect setting, right? Like everything can be controlled and set up in a way that maximizes learning in a perfect environment.
Yeah.
The beauty of in-home is it's imperfect, and that's what real life is like.
Yeah.
And so, your BCBA will be definitely very adaptable to the unique challenges that your family is experiencing, the unique community barriers that might be existing.
That's a big thing too, right? Is if you do have like specific community, sometimes if your child's in a clinic, they may not have the ability to kind of see those settings or be able to like go do a parent training in that setting, just depending on a lot of different things. But if it's in home, you are able to really kind of contrive those and work on those more if that is where the biggest area of support is for your family.
Right. And I think too, with a lot of these things, you sometimes don't know until you know.
Yes.
So, I mean, we've worked with families where they start off in clinic and they're like, this was great, thank you.
But no.
But we actually really need help at home. Or vice versa, like they're in home and they're like, well, my kid is missing all these social interaction pieces and like I want them to be with other kids. there is nothing wrong with trying something, communicating with your provider and saying, look, here's what I think would be the best fit for my family at this moment. What are my options?
Well, and I think too, it changes over time. So maybe when you're starting, maybe your child has a lot of interfering behaviors that are making it hard to be able to like access going out in the community, or, you know, feeling safe having them go to a place where you're not able to kind of have that higher level of just like comfort of like knowing exactly where everyone is at the same time. So maybe you do, you know, in-home for a little bit and then transition to a clinic and then eventually transition to school or whatever your long-term goals are.
Yeah.
I think it's such a journey to kind of look across how you can really ideally strategically use different settings to reach your ultimate goal as a family.
Agreed.
Of kind of, you know, what you want to be able to do day to day.
Well, I think that kind of hits on like our final point here. You can utilize a combination of different types of services to get your child there. Just like what you said, it changes over time. That might mean you're using a mixture of different types of services. That might mean that your child is in school for the chunk of their day, and then maybe they go to an after-school ABA program. Maybe they start off in clinic for the day, and then they go to school, or they have, you know, in-home or whatever. Most, if not all, providers will be working with you on that. They should be working with you on that. And there are a lot of providers that are flexible on using a variety of settings to serve your child, especially if they know that that's going to be the most successful for them. Or even using a titration plan, so fading things down.
Which is always the ultimate.
Always the ultimate goal. So you might end up, you know, having your child splitting time, and then you're titrating that back slowly until, just like the child feels confident, you also feel confident as a parent that your child is ready. Because it can be scary when you've built up that trust with certain providers and technicians, and you're like, I don't know how they're going to be without them. That can be a great way to fade back to make sure that you feel comfortable and your child feels comfortable.
Absolutely. I think that was a great summation to it.
Beautiful. Well, I think we've already talked everyone's ear off a good amount on this topic, but we would love to hear any thoughts anyone has on this. If there are any behavior analysts listening to our podcast, if they have anything to chime in the comments, we would love to hear some other thoughts.
Absolutely. So we are Keeping It Behavioral, where we're guiding autism and fostering hope, and we're going to be dropping new episodes on Thursdays. So please, follow us on whatever podcasting app you use.
Spotify, Apple Music.
Whatever your preference is. And give us a follow on Instagram at Keeping It Behavioral. And just, a disclaimer that we are just behavior analysts, talking
we're just
about
two,
these topics.
We're just two women.
Two women. But this is not individualized advice or treatment guidance. We just want to create a community where we're able to kind of have these real conversations about these different topics and, share a little bit of our knowledge and background and how that applies to those areas.
And hopefully just give people some support as they're navigating this journey, because it can be very isolating, and I think also you're getting so much information at once.
And everyone has bias, right?
Everyone has bias,
even we have bias, right? But
the more information you have, there's power in making an informed decision that fits your family, your lifestyle, 100%, and your needs. 100%. Anyway, we'll hop off our soapbox, but we'll see you next time.